Hey guys, it's your girl Chef Sahira, and I am back with another video in our Before You Bake Basics series. My goal in this series is to provide bakers of all levels with the essential baking knowledge that will pave the way for success along your baking journey. In this series, we're going to talk about ingredients. We're going to go over the most commonly used ingredients when it comes to baking, and today we will be discussing flour. I personally believe that understanding the purpose and functions of ingredients can have a significant impact on the outcome of your final baked good. And once you have an understanding on how these ingredients work, that you will be able to discern between good and subpar recipes. I get that question a lot. How do I know this recipe is good? Or people want me to review recipes. If you don't know how ingredients work, then you're just taking recipes because they are on, let's say, YouTube, or you pull them off online. And if you don't know how the ingredients work, you'll never know why that recipe isn't good. So, understanding how ingredients work really, really, in my opinion, is crucial. It really can be the difference between a good recipe and a bad recipe. So, with that being said, let's dive deep into flour. So, I like to call this flour 101 because it's just some basic knowledge. And because flour is one of the most commonly used ingredients, I figured we'd start here. And because there's so many different flours in the market today, how do you know which flour to use? Growing up, all I knew was all-purpose flour, all-purpose flour. But we're gonna really dive deep to understand the different flours that you are seeing and which one. How do you know which one is right for the recipe that you're working on? Let's first understand what flour is. Flour is a powdery substance created when wheat or other grains are pulverized. This process is called the milling process. The most common varieties of flour are made from wheat, although any grain can be made into flour, including rice, oats, corn, barley, almond, etc. So before we go any deeper into flour and the different varieties of flour, we have to understand what gluten is. Gluten is a protein found naturally in the endosperm of wheat. And because the flours that we will be discussing are made of wheat, that gluten is present in wheat. The protein content is the primary differentiator in flour. Again, gluten is the protein. Therefore, high protein wheat varieties, anywhere from 10 to 14% protein, are classified as hard wheat. Low protein wheat, anywhere from 5 to 10% protein, is known as soft wheat. Doughs made from high protein flours are both more elastic and more extensible, which means that they stretch more and hold their shape better. These are the desired qualities in many breads and other yeasted products where a firm structure is required. However, these are undesirable qualities in pastries and cakes where the goal is flakiness or tenderness. The main difference between all the types of flour is in the protein content. More protein in a flour equals more gluten, and more gluten equals more solid structure for the baked good. Flour, the function of flour gives structure to our baked goods, but different baked goods require different structural support. Again, flour gives structure to baked goods, but different baked goods require different structural support. And that's when we start to see the different varieties of flour. It's because the amount of gluten. So let's take a look at the most commonly used flour. This is our all-purpose flour. All-purpose flour is a mix of hard and soft wheat, making it a good middle ground flour when it comes to gluten content. Therefore, it can be used in a wide variety of products without being too heavy or too delicate. All-purpose flour is great for cookies, muffins, pie crusts, pancakes, biscuits. So you'll see a lot of recipes call for all purpose flour, or it just may say flour. The next flour we come to is cake flour. And here we have a sponge cake shown. Sponge cakes, as you know, are nice and light and airy. This is the flour you want to use. Cake flour is the flour that you want to use for light and airy cakes, like a sponge cake, like an angel's food cake. Cake flour has the lowest protein content. Cake flour contains less proteins than all purpose flour and is milled to a finer texture. If you had to take all purpose flour and cake flour, you will definitely see cake flour is lighter. You can tell the difference. These two factors combined make it ideal for producing light and fluffy cakes, like again, like a sponge cake or angel food cakes. I only use cake flour in yellow cakes, cakes that have a butter base. I only use cake flour. If you have a recipe that calls for cake flour and you do not have cake flour and you only have all purpose flour, can you use it? The short answer to that is yes. Can you tell the difference? Yes. I will say that depending on the recipe, if it's an oil base, you probably can get away with it. But sometimes I have a recipe where I'll do half cake flour, half all purpose flour. So you really have to play around with it. But if a recipe calls for cake flour, I highly recommend that you use cake flour, especially for a yellow cake, for a light cake, for a sponge cake. And I will also say that I would sift for yellow cakes. I would always sift my flour. Now we come to pastry flour. When I went to culinary school, I had no idea there was a thing called pastry flour, but we used it a lot. Pastry flour is an unbleached flour made from soft wheat with protein levels somewhere between cake flour and all purpose flour, about 8 to 9%. Pastry flour strikes the ideal balance between flakiness and tenderness. Pastry flour can be used for pie crust, cookies, muffins, cakes, pancakes. Um, Actually, a lot of my recipes that I used in school called for pastry flour. It was easily accessible, so we just used it. But once you get into the restaurant world, what I found that they didn't use pastry flour. Again, I found that it wasn't as accessible, and it's a nice mix. If I don't even think I see recipes that call for pastry flour. The only recipes I see are the professional recipes that I have. But in the industry, I saw that they used all-purpose flour. Also, pastry flour was a little more expensive, so to me, it wasn't as cost effective. And I don't know that I can tell a difference. So, but I just wanted you to be aware of what um, pastry flour was because it is a thing. Next, here we have bread flour. And bread flour is very common. You will see this. You will see it in the store. Sometimes, actually, I don't find it as often as you would think. You know, larger supermarkets have it. Maybe smaller supermarkets, you won't find it. But bread flour is very common. Bread flour is made entirely from hard wheat. Bread flour, which comes in white and whole wheat varieties, has a higher protein content than all purpose flour. It's called bread flour, quote unquote, because most breads requires higher amounts of protein to produce lots of gluten. The larger amount of gluten helps bread rise higher. So in this photo, you can see that the person is kneading the dough and that develops gluten. A lot of yeasted products requires you to knead the dough so we can build up the gluten, right? We're producing more gluten. And sometimes you'll work with a dough where you have produced too much gluten. And there's a term you'll hear in the baking world that you need to let your dough relax. If you have too much gluten in your dough, you will not be able to work with your dough because now anytime you try to knead it or roll it out, it just keeps shrinking back. If you've ever experienced that you were trying to roll a dough and every time you rolled it, it kind of shrink back and it doesn't seem like it is expanding or getting larger, that is a sign that your dough needs to relax. So that's why I think it's really, really important to understand the different kinds of flour, because you can spend all day rolling dough and it's not going anywhere. Or when you're mixing your batter, if you're using flour, of course, there's flour in your batter, you can overmix it. And what you have done is develop too much gluten. You have developed too much gluten, and the end result is a product that is very crumbly or dense. A lot of recipes, flour is the last thing that you add because you don't want to mix it so long. So this is a sign of how can you tell a recipe is good? If you get a recipe and it tells you to add flour like in the first or second step, that's wrong, because now what you're doing is continuing to develop that gluten. And it may work for some people, but I just happen to know there's different methods when it comes to baking, different mixing methods. So most methods won't have you put your flour in first or middle, right? Flour is like the last thing that you add, especially in a creaming method. And I'll definitely go over the different mixing methods in another video. But you can over mix your batter. And this goes without saying, of course, bread flour is good for making breads, yeasted breads, bagels, pretzels, pizza dough. I use bread flour in my dinner rolls. I use bread flour in my apple turnovers, right? So I use actually a little bread flour and cake flour in my apple turnover dough. I also use bread flour in my, I said cinnamon rolls. Did I say cinnamon rolls? Cinnamon rolls, dinner rolls, apple turnovers, definitely. So bread flour serves its purpose, and if you need that gluten, so just think also when you think of pastries like danishes and stuff, you'll see recipes that call for bread flour. If you don't have bread flour and you only have all-purpose flour, there may be a slight difference. For the average person who can't tell the difference, you may be okay. Now we come to whole wheat flour. Whole wheat flour is made by grinding the entire grain, which includes the endosperm, the bran, and germ. Whole wheat flour tends to have a high protein content, around 13 or 14%, but the presence of the germ and bran affect the flour's gluten forming ability. Since bran can interfere with gluten's forming capabilities, whole wheat flour often produces a heavier, denser bread than all purpose and bread flours. This flour contains more nutrients and fiber than all purpose flour, making it popular among people who are health conscious. I do have a recipe that I use whole wheat flour. My morning glory muffins, I use whole wheat flour. Sometimes whole wheat can have a taste like I know I'm eating a wheat product, but I will say my morning glory muffins definitely you do not taste. It just tastes like a great muffin. And that's made with carrots, raisins, apples, pineapples, and coconuts. And you cannot tell that you are eating a wheat muffin. So if somebody is looking for a tasty whole wheat muffin, I definitely would go the morning glory route. Another type of flour is your white whole wheat flour. And this white whole wheat flour is ground from white wheat. The difference is simply in the actual wheat. White whole wheat is not bleached whole wheat flour. The different wheat makes this type of flour lighter, so it's great for baked goods. This is a great option if you are making muffins or cakes because it would give a slightly less dense result than whole wheat flour. Now let's talk about bleached versus unbleached. Technically, all flours are bleached, but it's the process by which it happens that set these two types of flour apart. Bleach flour is simply flour that was aged chemically, usually with peroxide, to speed up the aging process rather than naturally over time. Benzoyl peroxide is one of the most commonly used bleaching agents during flour processing. Foods made with bleach flour tend to be softer and have more volume than those that aren't. It can improve the texture of soft baked goods like cookies, cakes, muffins, etc. Unbleached flour has aged naturally after being milled. Unbleached flour is also denser than bleached flour, so it works well for sturdy desserts like pastries. Honestly, I don't even know that I pay attention to unbleached flour or bleached flour. I think I just grab it. But I think most of the flour you see will say bleach flour. Can they be used interchangeably? Can bleach flour and unbleached flour be used interchangeably? They can. While there may be differences in color, volume, and even smell of your baked goods from using one over the other, there will be very, very slight. Can you use one over the other? The answer, once again, is yes. But just know that bleached flour has been aged chemically, while unbleached flour has been aged naturally. You may want to just kind of note that unbleached flour takes longer to produce, so it is typically more expensive than bleached flour. Now we're going to talk about self-rising flour because it is a thing. It is definitely on the shelf. Do I use it? Um, I think I may use self-rising flour maybe once a year, and I use that for a peach cobbler. But typically I do not use self-rising flour. But I will tell you what it is. Self-rising flour is simply a blend of all-purpose flour, baking powder, and salt during the milling process. Be careful not to substitute self-rising flour for other flours while baking. The added ingredients can throw off the rest of the measurements in your recipe. So if you are following a recipe for self-rising flour, um, follow those ingredients. Don't take a recipe that calls for regular flour and mix it because the results will be disastrous. I'll tell you really quickly that before I went to school, I think I grabbed Presto. Like anytime I see Presto flour, I'm just turned off because in my mind, I remember making a cheesecake that had a cake bottom. So I didn't know how to bake. I didn't understand the difference or what the ingredients was and what flour did or anything like that. If you're taking a recipe or using flour that has baking powder, and on top of that, you add more baking powder. So now we have double a rise. So what's going to happen is that cake is going to rise all in your stove and all on the bottom of the stove and just create a mess. So I just really want you to take note that if you have a recipe that calls for self-rising flour, follow that recipe the way they say. Don't add anything extra to it. And again, self-rising flour. You probably see a lot of recipes for pancakes, biscuits. I don't find things. I don't find recipes for self-rising flour often, but I know I do make a peach cobbler with it. That would be the only thing that I use it for. And if you're in a pinch and you run out of flour and you want to fry something, and, that needs to be dredged in flour, I have used that for that. Just saying. So let's talk about some gluten-free options. And what is gluten-free? We know that gluten is that protein that's found in the wheat, right? So now there's a variety of gluten-free flours available from all sorts of grains, nuts, and starches. Almond flour being one of them. And let me just explain a little bit why people go gluten-free. Some people are have an intolerance to gluten. People with simple gluten intolerance have uncomfortable gastrointestinal symptoms such as gas, bloating, and diarrhea, but those symptoms do not last a long time. But on the other hand, for people with celiac disease, consumption of gluten can be very serious. Celiac disease results from damage to the small intestine whenever gluten is consumed and decreases the ability to absorb certain nutrients. The malabsorption of nutrients with this disease can cause vitamin deficiencies affecting the brain, nervous system, bones, liver, and other organs. So this is why it's important if something contains gluten, if people know, people need to be aware of what's in your product. So that's why it's important. Also, you don't want to bake something from somebody and they have a reaction. So I like to be very well aware of, this is a whole nother topic, like the allergens, because gluten is found in wheat. Wheat is listed as one of the allergens, the top 8 or 9. Now they have 9 allergens. So it's important to know what has gluten. The one thing I know for sure that I make that is gluten free is macaroons. My macaroons are made with almond flour. So almond flour doesn't contain that wheat, right? But it's still milled, pulverized. So you have almond flour. And we use this with the macaroons is almond flour with some confectioner's sugar and that whole process. But there's no flour in it. Um, can you substitute regular flour for all-purpose flour or in a recipe? I would definitely say you have to play around with it. It's not an even swap because the flour does different things. So you may have to find a recipe, a gluten-free recipe that works. I've tried some recipes. I know they have like a potato starch or rice flour. um, it's not my specialty, so I don't make it. I try to make things that I know I make well. So gluten free is not my area expertise, but I can make macaroons. That is the one option I'm willing to offer somebody. So, but I just wanted you to be aware. So, along with almond flour, like I said, you have rice flour, and there's a lot of stuff on the market. But if somebody says that they can't have gluten, now you can have a better understanding why. So that concludes our Flour 101, right? Our deep dive into the world of flour. I hope now that you have a better understanding of how flour works and the purpose. So now you'll be able to decide which flour is best for your baked goods. If you have any comments, please drop them in the comment section and I'll be sure to answer your question. Um, but be sure to like this video and subscribe to this channel and hit the notification button so you never miss out when I go live or upload any new videos and content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.